This is the Tree of Life, Season 24, Chapter 4. In this episode, we will be talking about how hierarchies determine the context length, which determines choice. To begin, the ability to project actions into the future requires expectations matching, whether the subject matching those expectations is itself or another. Expectation matching is thus the basic building block of consensus when it involves two subjects. In reverse substitution events, we saw that priority is determined such that the incoming consciousness is lower in the hierarchy, the outgoing consciousness is higher. In these events, the incoming consciousness enters the vessel of the outgoing consciousness after acquiescence, but before execution of some goal-oriented action. Thus, in the fulfillment of that action, the incoming consciousness limits the extent to which the outgoing consciousness must sublimate. But there is an added benefit. The outgoing consciousness determines the goal-oriented action, while receiving the benefit of the labor of the incoming consciousness. Further, we see that the incoming consciousness is alienated from their own ability to sublimate by meeting the expectations selected by the outgoing consciousness. This follows from the integration of the impulse of action by the outgoing consciousness. This expectation matching produces a basic building block of consensus, the pairing of the expectations of the incoming and outgoing consciousness for the benefit of the outgoing consciousness, according to his objective. There is thus a hierarchy to objectives established by hierarchical natural law. Now, we also explained in Season 24, Chapter 1, that consensus is linked to a particular rate of change reflected by a context length. Just as sublimation is only possible in substitution events, following negation, a shorter context length is linked to less recursion. Thus, we can see that because sublimation is tied to hierarchy by priority, so too is the context length within the transitionary analog structure within a sequential substitution event. This means that hierarchies can limit the context length within the analog transitionary structure within some range, limiting the ability of the sublimator to approach infinite recursion. More importantly, the loss of the ability to sublimate determines the change within any artifact of verbalization, and the corresponding histories eliminated by each shift in the artifact. Likewise, the ability to project any action into the future is also limited by the imposition of expectation matching by the hierarchy. Finally, the shift in sets represented by the context length will ultimately be managed by the hierarchy by altering the context length. Amongst physical objects, expectations may not reach their fulmination if those expectations are not grounded in fact. But for individuals, expectations can be determinative. If a subject is acting pursuant to a higher objective selected by a hierarchy, rather than their own spatial objectives, the result will often be failure to accomplish a goal. To return to the example of the digital streaming service in preference shifting. If, for example, you are limited to a certain context length, then the distance between two sets likewise will be limited. Thus, whereas ordinarily you might switch from, say, a horror to a comedy, being not fully adjacent, you might, if this length is limited, choose to switch from a horror to a thriller. Thus, context length might be managed by the hierarchy to restrict choices that you might otherwise have made within some predetermined limit. That's the end of the podcast for today.